This is Gary Johnson, a psychology and philosophy professor at the University of New Orleans. He's an engaging professor who encourages his students to grab life by the balls, but they don't really take him seriously since he drives a Honda Civic. He loves feeding his birds, he lives with his cats, eat and ego, and he enjoys living in a world of questions and ideas. Basically, Gary lives like a cat lady. Another side of him is he has a flair for all things electronic and digital, which landed him a part-time gig doing tech stuff for the New Orleans police. After some training, he soon finds himself hiding cameras, mics, and getting good recordings, mostly in contract killings. One day, police officer Claudette, who works alongside Phil, tells Gary that Jasper is officially suspended for beating up some teenagers. Jasper's the undercover cop who's supposed to pose as a hitman today. So now, a very reluctant Gary has to take his place. He gets in Jasper's vehicle, where the guy blames cancel culture for his suspension. Because, only cancel culture has a problem with cops beating up teenagers. Once he's ready, Gary goes to the restaurant where his client Craig is waiting for him. Surprisingly, despite being a mild-mannered guy, Gary manages to shed all of that for his tough hitman act. Craig's a real cocky son of a gun, so Gary does his best to appear equal parts chill and intimidating, especially after messing up a bit in the beginning and asking him amateur hour questions. He impresses Craig with his plans. He's going to do what he likes to call a bayou burial. His family has land in Bayou Gauche, so Gary's gonna bury the body there. Let the alligators do their thing. As for the head, well, teeth are a problem. Teeth means dental records, so he'll find a spot in the middle of nowhere. Dynamite that bad boy, and poof. When Craig asks about fingerprints, why, Gary already has a ritual for that. Remove the fingertips, disperse them separately. Divide the number of miles by the number of fingers. Say he's driving 50 miles, he'll be tossing a finger every 5 miles or so. Needless to say, Claudette and Phil are just as wowed as Craig is. Now, it's time to seal the deal. Gary tells Craig to look him in the eye and say plainly what he wants him to do. With all discretion out the window, Craig tells Gary to kill his guy in whatever way suits him best. In their van, Claudette and Phil rejoice since Craig just incriminated himself. After shaking hands, the hitman and his client finally part ways, only for Craig to be arrested by the cops. At that point, he realizes he's been set up by his contract killer. As Gary returns to the van, Claudette and Phil praise him for doing a phenomenal job. They find Gary himself to be a bit lame, but they much prefer having him around since Jasper's an a-hole. For his next cases, Gary always makes sure to research them and tailor-fit his appearance and persona to what he believes his clients would find most agreeable. And it works. He has a knack for being the person they need him to be. Gary also studied different accents, watches makeup and wig tutorials, so his characters are all varied. We got the Russian, the leather-clad brood, the beach bum-haired hunk, and the Patrick Bateman. Like clockwork, Gary gets all of his clients arrested, from a trucker-looking man to a wealthy older woman who wants a piece of him, to a shooter in the making who wants his mom killed. There's also this chain-smoking lady who wants her husband dead, and in exchange, she'll give him a speedboat. While teaching at university, Gary is visited by his pregnant ex-wife, Alicia. Despite their failed relationship, she's still the person who knows him best. Alicia is interested in the topic he was discussing in class, wondering if he really believes that people can change. According to Gary, people can change within their set points, which really isn't that much. She disagrees though, because according to recent research, one can change their personality well into adulthood. The 5 traits that make up the personality can all be altered within a few months if the person keeps behaving as if they are the person they want to be. Pretty soon, they might realize that the person is them. Sounds good. But while they're on the topic, Gary asks if she didn't have a couple decades to wait for him to change, and in her defense, she knew he was least interested in changing. He admits that a normal relationship isn't in the cards for him, and Alicia rather encouragingly says he just needs to find someone who's as messed up as he is. Eventually, Jasper's suspension ends, but Sergeant Henry Broussard doesn't give him his job back. For one, Gary's doing great. Conviction rate is high, and he has more range than him. And also, there's a video of Jasper beating up the teenagers. Naturally, the public's pissed, so Broussard wants Jasper to shut up and lie low. At home, Gary reads the file of his next target. She's married to a guy named Ray Masters, who works in his family's oil and gas business. Eventually, Gary meets with Madison Masters in a restaurant. He adopts the persona of a charmer named Ron, and unlike his previous clients, Madison looks very tense, uncomfortable with the whole situation. When asked what she does for a living, she begrudgingly says she's a devoted wife since her husband doesn't let her do anything. Seeing the pie he's eating, she asks to taste it before scarfing it down. Hubby has her on a stupid diet, so she can't usually eat this. They get to talking about dogs, and Gary isn't a dog person. Well, Madison finds cats creepy, which kind of offends him. They playfully roleplay as detectives investigating a serial killer cat. But soon enough, Madison remembers the dour circumstances of their meeting. In truth, she's really scared. Her husband is a bad person, and she says that Gary doesn't know what she married into. It just keeps getting worse. Madison feels like she's in prison, but she refuses to die in that place. Instead, she hopes that meeting with Gary is the best decision she's ever made for herself. However, her husband suddenly calls, which means she must leave quickly. She then tries paying Gary, but the man suggests she use the money to start a new life. If she changes her mind, or if she needs anything, she can just call him again. On his way home, Gary receives a call from his colleagues, who are confused by the turn of events. He explains that Madison is not a killer, and he's just serving the overall public good. In disbelief, Jasper points out that what he did was unprofessional. He should have gotten Madison in custody and let the jury decide if she was innocent. Jasper's really disappointed with the unusual outcome of the sting operation, and he wants Gary to know that it will be written up as such. He then leaves. Phil and Claudette think the call ended, but Gary's still on the other line, and he overhears them talking about how much of a smoke show Ron is. Gary isn't. But Ron? Oh, they both want some of that hitman hit. For a man who isn't interested in changing, Gary sure is good at this undercover business. Maybe this is his limited set point. He can adapt to his clients' perceived wishes, but only in the context of acting. He's a pretty nondescript guy, a divorced professor with nothing much going on, and a Honda Civic. Gary doesn't actually have land in Bayou, but he birdwatched there, and when he droned on about the different birds, Phil and Claudette found him lame. But Ron? Oh, Ron can get it. Ron is a lot of things Gary isn't. He's suave. He speaks confidently and charmingly, and he always seems so self-assured. Ron is the most normal of Gary's crafted personas. He isn't a caricature of anything. He speaks with no discernible accent, isn't in wig or costume. It's fitting that he used Ron for Madison, who's also his most normal-seeming client. She's clearly tense and fidgety, and unlike the others he put behind bars, the woman didn't necessarily order the hit out of greed, spite, or general sociopathy. Madison did it because she has a controlling husband who always has a proverbial hand around her neck, keeping her from even eating pies. At least, that's the story Madison is telling. It can't be overlooked that the woman is still capable of putting a hit on another human being. The woman looked quite convinced when Gary urged her to take the money and leave, but she completely leapt over that option by going straight to murder. As for Gary, he clearly isn't the most normal guy around. For one, he admitted it himself. He struggles to have a normal relationship, and his ex-wife noted that he needed someone who could complement his messed upness. The ease in which he just got into character right away when he met Craig was also suspect, but he does have an explanation for that. While Gary wasn't the kind of person that could ever get worked up enough to want to kill or die for anything, he was correctly casted for this because his primary interest was the eternal mystery of human consciousness and behavior. After some days, Gary attends the trial of the people the NOPD arrested through their sting operations. To his surprise, Craig's lawyer portrays him as a dishonest and manipulative person. He knows that the lawyer is just doing her job, but still, it hurts him to listen to a personal attack. Thankfully, the jury finds Craig guilty as charged. On the other hand, the woman who tried paying Gary with a boat is found not guilty. Her man forgives her, and they get a second chance at love, or whatever that is. One evening, Gary gets a text from Madison, who invites him to an animal rescue event. After much consideration, Gary shows up at the event and expresses how glad he is to be there. He and Madison make small talk before the lady shares she's got her own place now in St. Roch, and that she's getting a divorce. She also thanks Gary, or shall we say, Ron, because he gave her the courage to move on with her life. Gary plays with the dogs, he plays with the kids, and Madison gets even more endeared. That night, the two have dinner together. Madison finds it hard to believe that Gary is a hitman, because he's too kind. For the record though, he doesn't kill randomly. It's always with a purpose. To protect. And some people need killing. She agrees with him on that. But what she wants to know is the difference between the real Ron and his occupation. So, Gary reveals he's a people person. The only problem is that he has to be a lone wolf to be most effective in that job. In the end, Gary fails to resist Madison's charm and spends the night with her at her place. He can't help but think about the fact that he's sleeping with someone who's capable of having a lover killed, but he admits that it upped his game. It brought out something really passionate in him. After their tryst, Madison insists on seeing each other, and although he thinks it's a bad idea, he stresses that the less they know about each other, the better. So he can't get too personal or give out too much info. Madison signs a contract agreeing to these terms, but with her lips. And so, Gary and Madison meet whenever they can. They talk and fool around a lot. He even teaches her where to shoot someone if she really wants to go for the kill. He continues on with both his jobs, and at one point, he teaches about the id, the ego, and the superego. Later, Gary as Tilda Swinton gets another client arrested. During that man's trial, his lawyer declares that someone who once committed a crime of passion is no more likely to commit that crime than any other member of society. He believes that Gary was attempting coercion whenever he'd meet his clients, especially since he'd take time to look them up and disguise himself. He also wants to know if Gary is trying to hide something, and with the man being badgered, Gary asks himself, what would Ron do? Right after that, he locks in. He sternly tells the lawyer that it's not his job to analyze the events around his meetings. His job is to meet the clients at those circumstances and complete the picture they've already drawn for themselves. When Gary goes to Madison's place again, the woman shows him the gun she owns. She clarifies it's just for protection, leading Gary to take her to a shooting range despite their agreement not to leave their love nest. There, he teaches her how to shoot a person in the heart. Afterward, the two go to a bar where Madison's husband, Ray, sees them. He's a very aggressive and entitled guy, and with how he keeps trying to pester Madison, Gary introduces himself as her boyfriend, which just pisses him off more. Madison just wants to be left alone, but Ray suddenly grabs and insults her. Without even thinking, Gary points a gun at him and demands he apologize to Madison. Feeling confident, Madison tells Ray that Gary is a professional and that he'll do it. Luckily, he doesn't have to do anything because Ray is forced to back off. Before the night ends, Gary eats some ice cream with Madison and asks if she's really divorced now. Instead of answering the question, Madison simply shows him she's not wearing a wedding ring. Still, he finds it weird that they ran into Ray, prompting Madison to admit that she broke their contract. She's willing to sign a new one once they get home in the same way she signed her old one. Unfortunately, Gary sees Jasper from a distance, and the man also spots him. After grabbing some takeout, Jasper approaches the couple and introduces himself to Madison. He wonders if they've met before, eventually letting the two get back to their dessert. Once Jasper is gone, Gary tells Madison he's just some guy he used to work with. The following day, Gary gets annoyed when he finds out he'll be meeting a new client. He's got no notice, so he wasn't able to do his research. For Jasper, this is the time for him to prove how good he is. Phil then briefs him, saying they didn't get much info on their guy, Mike. They also don't have a Title III warrant, which means they can only rely on audio. As it turns out, This Mike guy is none other than Ray. Gary sits behind Ray and stresses he shouldn't look at him, asking how he can help. Ray wants his wife dead because he can't accept that she's already going out with someone else. They're going through a divorce right now, and he'd be the #1 suspect if he took care of the situation himself. Surprised, Gary asks if they aren't technically divorced yet, but Ray tells him to mind his own business. He orders the hitman to get rid of Madison's new boyfriend too, if ever they're together. Also, he wants the hitman to let Madison know it was her husband who put a hit on her. This time, Gary faces Ray and offers to kill Madison's boyfriend for free. Naturally, Ray panics upon seeing him and announces he'll take care of his problem on his own before fleeing. Returning to the van, Gary simply tells his confused colleagues that their client freaked out. He then gets in his car and calls Madison, advising her to stay out of her house and warning her about Ray. Suddenly, Jasper gets in the vehicle too, and demands to know what happened. He thinks the client left because Gary is getting sloppy. So, Gary just agrees with him and tries to talk to him about Madison, but surprisingly, Jasper understands, as he's fooled around with his share of suspects. When Gary reaches Madison's place and explains what happened, the woman doesn't show any sign of fear. She knows she's safe with Gary, and that Ray wouldn't actually hurt her. At university, Gary asks his students to pretend they're a nomadic community, with an unhinged leader that's detrimental to them. Now, while Gary acknowledges that execution is ruthless, it's potentially the right choice, historically speaking. It's a dark thread in our historical DNA to weed out such destabilizing forces to 1. Protect social coherence and norms, and 2. Eliminate an abusive and uncooperative person from the gene pool. Meanwhile, a student wonders since when did their professor become hot. The line between Gary and Ron is truly blurring. For one, he's forgone the vaguely Jeffrey Dahmer/dad, who's ready to help you with your science project look for something that's still tasteful, but more attractive. Case in point for this class, he has a few buttons undone, which contrasts his usual fully buttoned look, and he has on a nice pair of pants instead of shorts. There are also subtle changes to the way he carries himself, and those coupled together has even his students noticing that he's becoming more attractive. In the end, it looks like Alicia's right. The personality can be altered within a few months by embodying the traits you want to have consistently. She referenced the as-if principle, and Gary's got it. He constantly behaves as if he's Ron around Madison, and now, he's slowly becoming him. Later at the police station, Jasper and Gary learn that Madison's husband was found dead in Cabbage Alley, with a single bullet to the aorta. The gun that was used was a .38. Claudette also shares their discovery. Madison got into a fight with Ray outside of a bar called Virgo's, where the man she was with pulled a gun on her husband. Luckily for Gary, they haven't identified that guy yet. Jasper suggests they talk to that man since she could be Madison's new boyfriend and volunteers to take on the job with Gary. After that, he takes Gary to Virgo's, where he slyly tells Mr. Boyfriend that he won't reveal his secret. This is where Gary gets defensive and stresses that he only ran into Madison the other night. But Jasper knows that Mike is Ray, Madison's husband. And the thing is, he reviewed Gary and Ray's conversation, and it took on a whole different layer of meaning for him. At Madison's place, an agitated Gary finds out that the woman already knows Ray is dead. She clarifies she was going to tell Gary about it, but how did he even hear about it? Ignoring a phone call, he explains that he listens to police scanners. Now, why is she weirdly okay with what happened? Madison argues that she's still processing it all. This is when her emotions finally spill, prompting him to comfort her and ask if the police informed her of Ray's death. The authorities think there was some illegal substance deal going on. She also admits how scared she is because she's the one who killed her husband. Needless to say, Gary is shocked. But since he warned her about Ray, Madison made a move first by tracking the guy and shooting him while he was asleep. She doesn't understand why Gary is so upset by this since he's a hitman, so he finally reveals he's only pretending to be one, and that he's never killed anyone before. He has no choice but to explain everything, especially the part where he helps the NOPD in their sting operations. He confesses he didn't want to lose Madison, which is why he kept pretending to be Ron, the contract killer. Seconds later, Gary answers his incessantly ringing phone, and is instructed by Claudette to return to the station, because they got a new development on Madison Masters. He tells Madison he'll come back, but she doesn't want him to. Back at the police station, Broussard informs Gary that Madison is now their #1 suspect, while Claudette shares that Ray increased his life insurance policy by $1 million. It's a policy in which his wife was named the sole beneficiary. Phil adds that the policy predates the initial solicitation attempt, but the homicide team now believes there's some connective tissue there. They think that Madison coerced someone else to kill Ray after her meeting with Gary, or maybe she did it herself. Despite knowing the truth, Jasper asks Gary if he talked to Madison again after their first meeting. The professor claims he ran into her at Ted's Frost Stop, and that she thanked him for helping her out, but he also mentions running into Jasper that same night. He even emphasizes that Jasper talked to Madison, but the guy says he didn't realize it was her. That aside, Gary lets everyone know that Madison left her husband and seemed to be doing well, so he'd be surprised if she actually killed Ray. As if playing out his earlier discussion, Gary's id, ego, and superego are battling it out. As he explained, the superego is the conscience, rewarding us for proper and societally acceptable behavior. Now, the id, that's the primitive desires that seeks nothing but pleasure while ignoring the consequence. Ego is the middleman which, in Gary's words, forever attempts to maximize pleasure while minimizing the cost. In the beginning, he was walking that tightrope with Madison, but the more Ron got to him, the more he leaned more into his id, and it made him sloppy. He pulled out a gun on Ray, he sized him up in the diner, and he told Madison everything. His "what would Ron do" mantra may have helped him stand up for himself in court and seem more charming to others, but beyond that, it's just pushing him down fast in the slippery slope of his own creation. The consequences are there, and either Gary's blind to them, or he's scoffing in the face of them. As for Madison, she's completely unraveled and proved that she's exactly who she was in the beginning, a woman who's capable of killing in the name of self-preservation. What she did technically wasn't self-defense, and though learning about that stressed Gary out, he doesn't seem to have any intentions of ratting her out. He knows it's wrong, but it looks like Gary's living out what he told Madison before. Some people need killing. That, or he's just looking the other way because it's Madison. To solve their problem, Jasper suggests they put a wire on Gary and have him speak with Madison as Ron to get her to talk. Everyone likes this idea of concerned check-in, so Gary agrees with them too. Next, they all prepare for the operation, and Jasper even gives Gary an earpiece. As Claudette and the others wait in the van near Madison's place, Gary goes to the woman's house and tells her they need to talk. All the while, though, he has his notes app open, guiding Madison on what's up and what she should do. He tries to make her confess to Ray's killing, and the woman follows his lead by denying that she has anything to do with it. All she knows is he got shot while buying some illegal substances, which he's always had a problem with. She also recounts her encounter with Ray outside Virgo's, but swears she doesn't know the name of the guy she was with because she only met him on the dance floor. This is when Ray pushes the, "Oh, so you're just going with random men you don't know" card, which has Madison pretending to be affronted and noting that, well, the man was a damn good dancer. Hearing the conversation, Jasper instructs Gary to nail her on the insurance policy. That's exactly what the professor does. But thanks to his notes, Madison is able to put on the best performance of her life. She states she doesn't even know if she'd get any of Ray's money, for the man could have changed the beneficiary when they broke up. In addition, she makes it clear she doesn't care about her husband's money. For the finale, Gary asks Madison through his phone to kick him out. The two continue arguing for a bit more before Madison kicks Gary out of her house. Gary keeps offering her a way out of this if she confesses because if she gets caught, he gets caught, but Madison just stresses that she didn't kill Ray. As he returns to the van, Claudette and Phil start thinking that Madison is innocent, and surprisingly, Jasper's thinking the same thing. That night, Gary goes back to Madison's place, only to find Jasper waiting there. While Madison gets more beer, Jasper praises her and Gary for their brilliant acting. At this point, he shares what's on his mind. 1. He was hoping the whole thing would blow up in Gary and Madison's faces so he could get his job back. And 2, if the couple got away with it, he'd just have to settle for Madison's money. He's talking about the insurance policy. If the two agree with him, he will stay silent, and no one will go to prison. Eventually, Jasper reveals he's been following Gary and Madison. He has enough evidence to put Madison away for life, and Gary will be considered as her accomplice. Furthermore, Jasper is certain that Madison killed Ray because he knows Gary isn't capable of killing. But suddenly, he starts feeling hot and unwell. It isn't long before he loses consciousness, prompting Madison to admit she spiked the guy's beer. Well, since they're at the point of no return, Gary calmly takes a plastic bag from the kitchen and places it over Jasper's head to suffocate him. He believes they'd all be better off, including the police, if he wasn't around anymore. He plans to make it look like Jasper took his own life in his car in a remote area somewhere, which won't be hard since his wife left him years ago. Besides, everyone knows he's a dirty cop. Gary then confesses to Madison that he's in love with her, and the woman does the same. They're aware there are some loose threads they'll have to deal with, but as long as they're together, they're sure they'll be okay. Years later, Gary and Madison now have a lovely home with dogs and 2 beautiful children. Their daughter wants to know how they met, so Madison explains that Daddy was acting all tough, but she could tell that he's the nicest guy she's ever met. As for Gary, it was love at first sight. With all things said and done, Alicia's truly the person who knows Gary the most. It's not necessary for him to enter a normal relationship. He just needs to find someone as screwed up as he is, and that's what he found in Madison. He knows what she did, and he took her as she is, even helping her with murder. It was the final thread of his transformation, and from then on, he's completely changed. He's no longer the guy Jasper knew who was absolutely incapable of murder. In fact, he did it with absolute calmness. In the beginning, he was encouraging his students to grab life by the balls, and that's exactly what he did. He broke his code and rules, hooked up with a former quote-unquote client, and was complicit in her killing an abusive and controlling man who believed he owned her to the point that her life had to end when his possession of her did. While Gary, he killed a sleazeball in the force, someone who wouldn't be missed by anyone. Also, from not liking dogs, Gary now has them in his house. People say that love can really change a person, but it's always up to the person to change. This story is actually inspired by a real-life Gary Johnson. Instead of New Orleans, he lived in Houston and taught psychology at a local community college. Like the character, he also had cats named Id and Ego, and a side gig as an undercover hitman. He never killed anyone, though. The movie completely made that up, and he didn't marry any Madisons. The character of Madison, however, was inspired by a real woman with an abusive boyfriend who she was terrified of leaving. Gary Johnson referred her to social service agencies and a therapist to help her and move her into a women's shelter. Sadly, Johnson passed away before filming officially started, but the director had been in contact with him and called him the chillest dude imaginable.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.